Hello, AP Psychology students. Welcome to the last unit of AP Psychology. This is Social Psychology. We are in Module 74, and the title of this is Attribution, Attitudes, and Actions. We are going to be looking and defining, what is social psychology, what do they study, how we tend to explain others' behavior and our own behavior. So that's going to be the attribution part, and looking just overall at our attitudes and actions and what are some of the theories and concepts with that. So social psychologists focus on the situation. They study the social influences that explain why the same person acts differently in different situations. So I just want you to be thinking about yourself, all right? So you certainly know that you don't act the same in every situation, and a social, and depending upon the people that you are with. So when we think socially, we certainly think of more than, yourself, more than maybe 2 or 3 people. We think of a social situation. All right. So for example, social psychologists study the effect of home team advantage, the impact of racism and discrimination, the driving motivation in gangs, the explanations we give for our own and others' behaviors. So these are the 3 main areas, just as we mentioned. Social thinking is overall how we believe, what our attitudes are, what our judgments are, how we are influenced by things like culture and, how we need to conform to social expectations, forms of persuasion, and then also looking at social relations. And that is where we get into and digging deeper and looking at levels of prejudice, aggression, but also looking at things like attraction and intimacy and altruism, which is helping others. So the first thing we're going to talk about is how we attribute, and attribute means how do we explain our own behavior, the why, and then how do we explain others. And the 2 main types of attribution is called personal attribution or situational attribution. And that is actually spelled wrong. So there's a little typo there I just recognized. Okay, so Fritz Heider proposed what he calls the attribution theory. And it basically says that when we are explaining others' behavior versus our own, that we tend to blame the behavior of others to their own personal, internal, stable, enduring traits, which we would call a dispositional attribution. I sometimes like to think of it as we tend to explain other people's behavior based on their personality. And we tend to attribute, and then we also may attribute it to an external situation, which we call a situational attribution. So if Jack eats an entire cake, do we explain that behavior by noting that Jack has not eaten in days? Is it situational? Or is it that Jack is a greedy and glutinous individual, like more like his personality, which we would call his disposition? Right, so here is a dispositional attribution. Julia is taking an AP psychology test and frequently glances at the test of the student next to her. Or is it situational, that maybe that's not her personality, but it might be more of just that particular situation. But then we also have Brian volunteers 5 hours a week to help homeless children at a nearby shelter and learn to read. So is that more his disposition or is that more the situation? All right, so, and what it's actually asking you to do, so it says for each situation, attribute the behavior. So if Julia is taking an AP test and frequently glances at the test of the student next to her, if it's a disposition, you would kind of explain it that maybe she is, selfish, or that she is extremely competitive and overachieving. And so she will do whatever it takes to get the answers. And with Brian volunteering 5 hours a week, we could maybe explain his behavior based on it's a situation where there's a lot of people in that particular community that are homeless, and that he is going to help them because of that high homeless group. All right, so Gerald recently moved to a new school and is having trouble making friends. When students pass him in the hall, he looks down and moves quickly to his next class. Can you attribute Gerald's behavior both dispositionally and situationally? Which is the correct attribution? All right, so some people might make an assumption about Gerald that he is doesn't like people, or that he's just really shy. But maybe it could possibly be just the fact that he's moved to a new school and he is feeling a little uncertain and a little insecure, but he might not necessarily be an insecure or shy person. It might just be this new situation. So just be thinking about, you're going to really be, but the one thing that I remember the first time I learned social psych is it just completely changed my view and understanding of the world and the social situations. And this is a great opportunity to do a lot of observation. Sit back and just observe others' behaviors, especially in groups. Okay, so there is a concept called the fundamental attribution error. And this is the tendency for observers when analyzing others' behavior to underestimate the impact of the situation and to overestimate the impact of a personal disposition. I'll give you the example here and then I'll come up with another one. For instance, when passing a homeless person on the street, the fundamental attribution error suggests that we might be more likely to attribute their homelessness to their own personality, lazy or unmotivated, rather than to the situation, loss of job, breaking up the family, or maybe having a psychological disorder like schizophrenia. Now, you may not agree. You may say, I would certainly not be assuming it's their personality is why they're homeless. But here's another example that I like to give. Let's say you're driving down the road and somebody cuts you off on the road, and you might scream some obscenities. Okay. And when you're upset, you're probably, what you might be yelling is like, you idiot, which is a disposition, right? It's like saying somebody's an idiot. It's like they're part of their personality, rather than saying, oh, you must be on the way to the hospital because your wife just gave birth to, your first child, right? Yeah, right. You don't yell out like situational factors, right? You tend to yell out things that you're assuming that they've got these certain personality traits. So that's the fundamental attribution error. And I'm going to say it again. It means we underestimate, like when we're analyzing another person's behavior, we tend to underestimate the fact that there could be situational forces that are more to explain why they're behaving the way they're behaving. And we overestimate more about their personal disposition or their personality traits. All right, so what factors affect our attributions? One factor is culture. Individualist Westerners more often attribute behavior to people's personal traits. People in East Asian collectivist cultures are more sensitive to the power of the situation. So we're individualist cultures here in the United States. We tend to attribute more to people's personality traits, but more collectivist cultures like South America, Asian collectivist cultures, you're more going to be sensitive to the power of the situation. When we believe our own behavior, we are sensitive to how behavior changes with the situation. After behaving badly for someone, we recognize how the situation affected our actions. Recall the self-serving bias. So we tend to think more about our own situations and how they might be explaining it. So let's say you yelled at a friend. You wouldn't necessarily say that you're an angry person. You might be like, well, in this situation, this friend did something that really was upsetting and I had a reason to be angry. Why do attributions matter? Whether we attribute poverty and homelessness to social circumstances or to personal dispositions affects and reflects our political views, right? So just pay attention. Think of the different political positions and whether they are more explaining people's behavior based on situational forces or more about personality, like more stable things. Congress is preparing to pass legislation providing federal taxpayer dollars to address the homelessness situation in our country. Money will go to build homeless shelters, mental and physical health care, and job training centers for the homeless. If you hold a situational attribution towards homelessness, you're likely to be in favor of the legislation, but you are going to probably be more likely to be against it if you tend to have more dispositional explanations for others' behavior. All right, so this one I'm actually going to skip over, but I'd tell you to reflect on it a little bit more on your own. All right, so this is actually the explanation I gave you before about driving, so I'll skip over this. So another thing we're going to talk about today, so we talked about attributions and how we attribute behavior. Now we're going to talk about attitudes. You've heard that word, you've used it many times, but let's talk about the formal definition. Feelings often influenced by our beliefs that predispose us to respond in a particular way to objects, people, and events. If we believe someone is threatening us, we may feel fear and anger toward the person and act defensively. The relationship between our attitudes and our actions is two-way. Our attitudes affects our actions, and our actions affect our attitudes. One experiment used vivid, easily recalled information to persuade white sun tanning college students that repetitive tanning put them at risk for future skin cancer. 1 month later, 72% of the participants had lighter skin compared to 16% of those in the control group. Persuasion had changed the attitude. So they were persuaded, whether it's true or not, which, we're assuming there was a lot of evidence to show that, tanning is going to cause cancer. But it was a persuasion technique, and it changed the attitude about the skin cancer risk and change. And then as a result of a change in attitude, there was a change in the actions, the actual behaviors. So there are different types of persuasion. We're going to learn two today. The first one is called the peripheral route of persuasion. Actually, I'm going to go back here for 1 second. Yeah, so this is just talking generally. Okay. So the peripheral route of persuasion is when people are influenced by incidental cues, such as a speaker's attractiveness. So think of the word peripheral, it means on the outside. So it means you're not being persuaded based on factual, like direct information about whatever the topic is that you're going to develop an attitude about. You are being influenced, if it's peripheral, by other like outside things, like how attractive the person that's talking, how influential the person is in general. Like maybe it's like a celebrity. And so you're like, oh, well, if they said it, then I need to believe it. Peripheral route persuasion uses attention-getting cues to trigger emotion-based snap judgments. Endorsements by beautiful or famous people can influence people's attitudes, whether the judgment is about choosing a political candidate or buying the latest smartphone. So that's peripheral route on the outside. It's like incidental cues. The central route of persuasion is when people are influenced by arguments and respond with favorable thoughts. So there's actual arguments or levels of evidence that are used to present to try to persuade. So it offers evidence and arguments that trigger careful thinking to persuade buyers to purchase a particular phone. An ad might itemize the phone's greatest features. To increase support for climate change intervention, effective arguments has focused on accumulating greenhouse gases, melting Arctic ice, rising world temperatures and seas, and extreme weather. All right, so you see how this is more about the specific arguments that have to do with the specific topic. So here's just another example. When you're looking at the central route, there is high motivation and ability to think about the message itself. It's not all the external things. There's deep processing focused on the quality of the message, arguments, and then lasting change that resists fading and counterattacks. Peripheral is low motivation or ability to think about the message. You're not really thinking about it. It's almost like it's just you're kind of being guided. And it's superficial processing and low motivation or ability to think about the message. Excuse me. So You can think about this. Explain how central root and peripheral persuasion could be used by your school's cafeteria to increase lunch sales. And we'll come up with some examples in class. Can actions impact attitudes? Not only will we stand up for what we believe, we also will more strongly believe in what we have stood up for. So they kind of mutually can influence each other. So attitudes can follow behavior. Cooperative actions, such as those performed by people on sports teams, including Germany, shown here celebrating a World Cup victory, feed mutual liking. Such attitudes in turn promote positive behavior. All right, so we certainly know that if we are behaving, and we're going to talk about this in an altruistic way, like helping other people, that may make our attitudes, going to improve our attitudes about helping behavior. And then it might make it more likely that you're helping others in the future. But they can be mutually influencing. So here's an example. It's called what is the foot in the door phenomenon? It's the tendency. This is about, it's almost like persuasion, getting you to generate a particular attitude. And it's the tendency for people who have first agreed to a small request to comply later with a larger request. So to get people to agree to something big, start small and build. A trivial act makes the next act easier. Succumb to the temptation and you will find the next temptation harder to resist. Okay, so just saying, you're talking to your parents, okay? Like, let's say you want to spend the night at your friend's house. You start by just saying, hey, is it okay if I go hang out there for a little while? I'm going to go have dinner there. And then you're like, oh, is it okay if we watch a movie? Oh, yeah, sure. All right, well, it's already getting close to 11 o'clock. Why don't I just spend the night? All right, but don't tell them I told you this. Foot in the door phenomenon. Try it. All right. So here's another example of it. In one experiment, researchers sought permission to place a large drive carefully sign in people's front yards. The 17% rate of agreement soared to 76% among those who first did a small favor, placing the "Be a Safe Driver" sign in their window. So they do this. Politicians like, well, do you mind just putting this in your yard? I mean, even if you haven't made a decision yet. And then eventually you've got a big banner in the yard, and then eventually you're going door to door canvassing, like trying to support that candidate. So, all right, here's another term. What is a role? A role is a set of expectations about a social position, defining how those in the position ought to behave. When you adopt a new role, when you become a college student or begin a new job, you strive to follow the social scripts or norms. At first, your behaviors may feel phony, but before long, what began as play acting in the theater of life becomes you. And I mean, my daughter just got home from school today, and she would certainly tell you that it was hard. She was transitioning, but now she certainly has adapted and understands her role as a college student. So there is a very famous study. We're going to actually be watching this in class. We're going to look at some video. I'm going to tell you just really quickly about it. So this is, or I'll just read through this with you. Role-playing morphed into real life in one famous and controversial study in which male college students volunteered to spend time in a simulated prison. And there were two groups. There was one group that was assigned the role to be the prison guards. And then the other group was assigned to be the prisoners. And they really tried to simulate it and make it seem like a real experience. So like they were, I think they were planning to do it for several weeks. And they even went to the college students' homes and arrested them, just like a real situation where they might have to go to prison or go to jail. And so what happened, let's look here. So this is giving more of an example of the two groups, but some guards developed disparaging attitudes and a third became tyrannical, devising cruel and degrading routines for the prisoners. One by one, the prisoners broke down, rebelled, and became passively resigned. So really the main point of this study is it's talking about how powerful the situation was itself, and them taking on those particular roles of whether they were a prisoner or a guard, prison guard, and that they almost started to lose their sense of self of who they were before they took on this role play. And it was a very toxic situation. And those assigned to the guard role soon degraded the prisoners. So they really kind of took on this very aggressive role. And this was not their personality beforehand. So what we do, we gradually become. Every time we act like the people around us, we slightly change ourselves to be more like them and less like who we used to be. Although the volunteers in the Zimbardo study knew it was a research setup, they knew it was just a research study, they still kind of lost their sense of self. They began to act more and more like their assigned roles, and they took on the roles and performed the behaviors. So what actually happened with that study, they ended up having to shut it down early. I think it was only after maybe like a week or so, because they just were noticing that it was really psychologically affecting them. The prisoners were seeming like almost to be developing mental health concerns. And then the prison guards were just the level of aggressiveness and watching their, personalities change in this role, that they decided just to shut down the study. Okay, so I think this might be one of the last things we talk about today. So there's one other theory today. This one's called the cognitive dissonance theory. Festinger's theory that we act to reduce the discomfort, the dissonance. If you ever heard the word dissonance, that's like just kind of an internal conflict and feeling of being uncomfortable. We feel when two of our thoughts, cognitions, or our thoughts and our behaviors are inconsistent. So like sometimes you might hear the word, like thinking of it like a hypocrite. If you are being a hypocrite, you have a particular attitude, but yet how you're behaving is very different from that. All right, so when we become aware that our attitudes and our actions clash, we can reduce the resulting dissonance, like the discomfort, by changing our attitudes. All right, so here's the example: a person who smokes and enjoys, let me just reading it again, I'll tell you. So if you let's say you have an attitude that you know that smoking is bad for you and that it can cause cancer and that people shouldn't smoke, but you really enjoy smoking and you actually are smoking, there's dissonance, right? Your attitude is smoking is wrong, but yet you're smoking. And so what happens is there's got to be some change to reduce that dissonance. So to relieve the dissonance, a person might either change, stop smoking, or change the thought. I may die young, but at least I'm enjoying myself. So it's almost like you're rationalizing, right? You start saying, oh, well, smoking's not that bad. And, I'm young, I'm not going to smoke forever. So they're going to do something to relieve that dissonance. The discomfort we feel when our attitudes are not in line with our actions is called A, cognitive dissonance. I knew you got it. You guys always get these right. All right, I think that is the end of our video. Please take an opportunity to do some naturalistic observations and start noticing attitudes and behaviors and levels of cognitive dissonance that you're feeling, or maybe you might see, among family members. All right, and we will be having some powerful discussions about this in class. So have a great weekend. Take care. Bye.